So Lorwyn Eclipsed is coming out soon, and we wanted to do a quick video where we're just going to be kind of going over some of the recent articles coming out about it, some of the mechanics on the set, and discussing, how do we feel the overall set design has gone.
We got a lot to say about Lorwyn.
Right.
Turns out Lorwyn, it's important.
Distraction makers.
Lorwyn, to me, one, has been extremely influential on me as an artist, but also Lorwyn in the landscape of fantasy worlds is extremely important in terms of the different subgenres of fantasy that does not get all that much attention when compared to things like Tolkien.
Every single set, especially over the last handful of sets, I think it's done a very good job of marketing it with, you could say a single word. Tarkir Dragonstorm, that's the dragon set.
Mm-hmm.
Aether Drift, speed, racing, whatever, right? That's the Mad Max set.
Well, part of it was Mad Max, but also
Look,
Speed Racer, and also look, maybe that's part of the problem.
It's a race.
It's a race,
Right?
It's the vroom vroom set.
Now, it doesn't mean that that's going to equal success, right? But it does make it more marketable. There is no confusion as to what Aether Drift was. Lorwyn is a little bit different. Lorwyn as a theme and as a setting, duality of light and dark is probably the closest that there is, but that's a pretty complex topic to get and hit someone over the head with a single marketing image.
Tarkir Dragonstorm, dragons, Edge of Eternity, space. Even when we go into Universes Beyond, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Spider-Man, right? These are very, Final Fantasy, it's very easy to say, what is this set about? It's about this.
You need some sort of a term or an image that is evocative and immediately resonates.
Lorwyn and this type of fantasy subgenre is hard to typify, I guess, for lack of a better term, where, you can point to something like The Dark Crystal, or you can point to something like Labyrinth or Brian Froud's work. It's fairies, but it's not fairies like Eldraine is fairies, right? It's not fairies like Disney fairies, like Tinkerbell. It's fairies that are weird, right? That there's a darkness to them. That is first and foremost, I think, the biggest challenge of Lorwyn. How do you communicate to this type of a world to an audience that isn't used to this type of fantasy? Because this subgenre of fantasy is particularly niche. If I was to approach designing a Lorwyn set or thinking about what is the most important thing to communicate this type of fantasy, it comes back to that duality, right? That there is the Seelie and the Unseelie, and that should be pervasive throughout the entirety of the set. It's not necessarily a conflict, though. It's more like two sides of the same coin, that these things coexist in the world as it is. And I think a lot of this comes from nature, generally, where there's a beauty to nature and there's a brutality to nature, and that those two things coexist together.
What you said earlier about how it's not necessarily a conflict, that's what makes this set so difficult to try and design for, is because even Mark Rosewater has said that at its core, Magic is a game about conflict. So to not have a set with any sort of conflict in it immediately makes it a lot harder to sell that set. So with all that being said, what then from the original set of Lorwyn has changed for Lorwyn Eclipsed?
Okay, so when we go back to the original Lorwyn, the lead designer for the original Lorwyn set was Aaron Forsyth. The set was handled in kind of a weird way at the time, and I think it was them partially wrestling with this third set problem, where we had Lorwyn, Morningtide, and then we had Shadowmoor and Eventide, and technically Lorwyn was sort of a two-set block, and Shadowmoor was kind of a two-set block, but they were also sort of tied together as part of the same world.
Yeah.
So it was a four-set block, but really it was two two-set blocks.
And it's possible that did contribute to some of the perceived negative attention of the set, is because it was already kind of a stretch trying to stay in the same block for 3 sets. And we've seen now how people have, at this point, they've decided that jumping from, set to set and removing this entire block of 3 sets in the same plane is not the direction that they want to go anymore. So having 4 sets be part of the same plane was just stretching it.
So why don't we go through some of the mechanics from the original set, and then we can talk about how they evolved in the new set.
If I've counted correctly, there's 19 mechanics.
That's a lot. Let's just list them real quick.
We have Champion, Changeling, Chroma, Clash, Colors Matter, Conspire, Evoke, Hideaway, Hybrid Mana, Kinship, Persist, Prowl, Reinforce, Retrace, Typal, 2 mana, untap symbol, wither, and -1/-1 counters. Not all of those were introduced in the Lorwyn block. Hybrid mana came from Ravnica.
I mean, there's like 4 sets, right? So there's 4 sets worth of mechanics. It's a lot. Notably, we have the mechanic Chroma, which eventually ends up becoming Devotion. Chroma cared about the number of color pips of like things that are in your hand or in your graveyard or on the battlefield, and then Devotion was just normalized to on the battlefield. Mark has an article is talking about sort of like some of the design philosophies behind the new Lorwyn set, and he listed mechanics into things that they should do, things that they should consider doing, and then things that they shouldn't do.
The Lorwyn Eclipsed team decided that these were the mechanics that they should do, which are Changeling, Colors Matter, Hybrid Mana, and Typal. Things that they should consider doing is the Champion mechanic, Evoke, Hideaway, Persist, Reinforce, 2 mana, Wither, and -1/-1 counters. And the things that they shouldn't do, Chroma, Clash, Conspire, Kinship, Prowl, Retrace, and the untap symbol.
Changelings makes perfect sense because Changelings were there to sort of solve the problem that they were having in limited gameplay where people would just kind of stay in their own lanes because the set is so focused on creature type, like typal matter, creature type matter.
And for this being the block that introduced Changelings, I think it just makes sense. I think it is kind of viewed as a somewhat iconic aspect.
Yeah, and it fits into the world itself too. Colors Matter is interesting.
What do they mean by colors matter?
Well, it ends up being like the vivid mechanic to reinforce the like creature type themes. You can do that through creature types, but also through color. So if you have something that's like an elf that cares about how many like black color symbols you have or something, then like you might end up drafting a black card just to do that rather than like sticking just to elves. So I feel like it's another way to sort of intermix the design play, but
right.
I don't know. That is interesting. I'm not exactly sure why Colors Matters ended up being such an important thing.
Typal is kind of the big one.
Yeah.
Typal is the one that I think really set this set apart, right? And as far as its themes go.
Well, then Hybrid Mana makes sense alongside anything that cares about colors mattering because you get sort of, you get the 2 colors from the hybrid mana symbols.
So the reasons from the article as far as why they didn't want to include these mechanics are the following. Chroma had been a bad first attempt at what would later prove to be a pretty popular mechanic when we redid it as Devotion. We did talk about including Devotion in the set, but felt it would be an odd inclusion from a flavor perspective. Clash and Kinship have been poorly received, Conspire and Prowl were unmemorable, Retrace had repetition of play issues, and the untap symbol proved to be problematic on 2 levels. Too many players confused it for the tap symbol, and it was hard for players to intuitively understand it. Which I think I had that exact same impression when I first saw an untap symbol.
Yeah, it is pretty weird.
And I wasn't so much, I actually do think I misread it, and I thought it was like a weird alternate art card or something that had like a different colored tap symbol. And then my next question was, well, when can I use this? How do I use this? Can I just untap it? Because it feels unintuitive that you could just untap it on your own.
And I think the biggest issue, this is something we talk about a lot, which is like when something should have an effect, a player should be sort of either like touching the card or should be an active participant in like the ability happening. And tap does this really well, right? Because you look at the tap symbol and go, oh, well, I can tap this and I get this effect. But untap, it happens sort of automatically by the game systems. So you'd have to have some way to tap it first, right? I think that's maybe the weirdness with it is that the default state of a creature is untapped.
Right.
And so you find a way to tap it and then can untap it to get the effect.
So it's only a benefit that you want to be untapped because you want to have it as a blocker, ideally anyways. Right. So it feels a little weird, like almost I shouldn't be able to get away with doing this.
Well, and it's definitely still like a limiting factor, right? Like you can only untap it and then you'd have to figure out a way to tap it again before you could untap it again.
Sure. Yeah. And if you wanted to keep going with it.
I think the original concept of this for me was that it's that duality again, where, you would have tap in Lorwyn and untap in Shadowmoor, and that way you have that sort of mirroring of the planes.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like I understand it from a thematic duality of light and dark standpoint, but I also understand that like, yeah, there's just probably too many shenanigans. Right. And if it's not intuitive, then...
I do think that is indicative of risks that Wizards used to take though. Like to me, like the untap idea it's pretty out there, right? It's like, can we even do this? Like, let's try and see what happens. And yeah, it didn't work out, but like in this instance, it didn't work out. But like, that's how you get new ideas and new mechanics is to try things like this. So,
all right. So the mechanics that they ended up adding, we've got Vivid is a new ability word that essentially cares about how many colors amongst permanents you control. It's like the ability of Bloom Tender. We have Blight, which is a new keyword.
Blight is like a sort of a payment that says you need to put a -1, whatever the Blight number is. It's like Blight X, and then whatever the blight number is, you put that many -1/-1 counters on a creature you control to pay for some kind of an effect. This can also be used in the inverse so that your opponent might have to pay it if it's used as like a ward cost. So if your creature has ward blight 1, that means your opponent has to blight 1 to be able to target your thing.
That's interesting. Next, we have Changeling. Changeling's making a comeback.
Changelings are just a creature that has every creature type.
Kindred is essentially just kindred spells. So it would be that there's like an enchantment, but on top of that, it might say enchantment merfolk or enchantment elves or something like that.
Which is also basically making a comeback. Originally in Lorwyn, it was just called tribal. So they're just changing the name of it.
Then we have double face cards are coming back. That's pretty self-explanatory. They're double face cards. These ones in particular, I believe are activated on main phase. You can choose to pay a certain amount and it will flip.
These ones have a little bit more agency than something like werewolves in Innistrad, where they would change based on like how many spells were played or whatever. These are like, all right, well, you can choose to pay a mana or something and then flip it over back to its other side. And they also go back and forth between the two sides. Right. It's not like they change just to one and then they're stuck there. And that's to get that sort of duality between Lorwyn and Shadowmoor happening simultaneously.
Right. This is something that Mark was commenting on, is that double face cards was like one of the first things they went to as this would be great.
It's easy. It's right there.
Then we have Convoke. Convoke is essentially that you can, as an alternative cost, you can tap a creature to lower a mana cost by 1 colorless pip to help pay
for a color of the creature.
Oh.
You can pay for colored mana with Convoke.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's because I don't play Convoke cards.
Convoke's good.
I'm sure it is. If I wouldn't know, I don't play them. And then we have Behold. Behold actually just came out in Tarkir Dragonstorm. It was Behold a Dragon, which is revealing a card of that specific type that it's asking you to from your hand. And if you do so, then you get an extra bonus. It's Kicker, but with Beholding.
But with show a card.
But with show a card.
Yeah, and I think Behold generally is a pretty successful mechanic, newer mechanic that they've kind of come up with, which is it is kind of a cleanup of some older ideas that they've had, like Forecast or
Champion was the one. In this case, they basically replaced Champion for Behold.
Yeah. Well, and Champion with the original Lorwyn was basically that you had to have a creature type of that in play, and then when the card that champions it comes into play, it exiles that card. But when the champion dies, the exiled card comes back. And so there were all kinds of weird timing issues with like, all right, well, I got to play my card, and then somebody removes the card that I had, so then I don't get the champion effect. Like, there's all kinds of weird problems with that mechanic generally.
And if really all you want is for someone to care about having the same type, then just Behold. Yeah. Prove that you have that type, and you get the bonus.
Behold, I think, is a really clean version of, hey, some type matters. Yeah. So let's make sure that you have that in your deck and that you can reveal it. So.
Yeah. And then we have Evoke. We got Evoke making a comeback, which is essentially that it's an alternative mana cost for a creature. I think it's only creatures, right? Has to be. Yeah.
It basically turns a creature into a spell, but the creature still comes into play and then is sacrificed. And they did a little bit of an adjustment on Evoke in this set, because originally something like Mole Drifter, probably most well-known from original Lorwyn, you pay its Evoke cost, it comes into play, you draw 2 cards, and then it dies, so you don't get the creature part of it. Where here, they've made it so that based on the type of mana that you spent, or the color of mana that you spent to play it, you're going to get different evoke effects. But what that means is that you can't like blink the creature to get the evoke effect again, because you wouldn't have paid any mana to get the ability. So, which powers these down a little bit, but now there's kind of a choice involved, I guess. So, I don't know. I don't really know why they powered it down.
We won't get to opinions yet.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have Persist. Persist is if a creature were to die and it doesn't have a -1/-1 counter, you bring it back and it has a -1/-1 counter.
Most famously, Kitchen Finks, our favorite hybrid mana card that for some reason everybody decided was the best hybrid mana card.
Didn't even know that was a card till the debates of hybrid mana were coming up. So we talked at the beginning of the episode talking about how duality of light and dark is kind of the main focus of this theme and of this set. Right?
I think if I had to pick something that was exemplary of this type of fantasy, it would be that, right? It comes back to that Seelie and Unseelie court, probably.
So this is something that they did address in the article, and I'll just kind of read a small snippet of their evaluation of that duality and kind of how they had to handle going about it for the design. It says here, what if instead of a setting where Lorwyn and Shadowmoor were at odds, we had a setting where they mingled? Yes, there would still be some conflicts between them, but the structure of the set didn't have to divide evenly. We could have Lorwyn elements, Shadowmoor elements, and some elements that mix the two aspects. The creative team had created areas that were neutral areas between the two sides, so there was a justification for why Lorwyn mechanics would interact with Shadowmoor mechanics. So this was kind of their issue that they were running into, is because all these sets previously were 4 sets, right, spread out amongst these planes. It's very easy for you to have this clean divide between you have Lorwyn and you have Shadowmoor, and they never actually ended up interacting with each other. But now, because you couldn't do 2 sets, they kind of mushed them together, and they had to figure out, well, what's going to happen when we mush these together? How do they interact? And they ran into a lot of issues with this. It's not only thematically, having to figure out narratively, like, why is this the case, but also set-wise, design-wise, how do these different mechanics, the -1/-1 counters and the +1/+1 counters, like, how can we decide how those interact in this way? Well, I'm assuming their main concern was making sure that it was fulfilling nostalgically to the players that were excited for the set, and made sure that they were meeting those expectations while not completely destroying the feeling of the themes.
Well, it sounds like in early vision design, they were looking at this more like it's Lorwyn versus Shadowmoor. They even talked about using like Mirrodin Besieged as like an example or a template of what they had done before. It's where you had like Mirrodin versus Phyrexians, where they were thinking like, well, maybe we can do Lorwyn versus Shadowmoor. And I think for a lot of reasons here in this particular setting, that doesn't quite have the right vibe, right? It's not that these things are necessarily like at war. It's that they coexist, but are distinctly different from each other, the reflections of each other. Yeah, and then so I think what they ended up running into, like you're saying, is that when you have like 4 sets that are separate and you're sort of trying to mush them into one, they were able to do some things with like merfolk, for instance, in Lorwyn were blue-white, and then in Shadowmoor were blue-black. And that created this interesting dichotomy between the two sort of like mirror universes, right? But when you try to mush those all together, you end up with almost an over-representation of some of these things in different colors. So it sounds like what their choice was to choose, all right, well, obviously we're going to have merfolk, and we're going to have fairies, and we're going to have these iconic creature types, but we're going to limit them to 2 iconic colors to sort of better fit into the mold of like what a modern design would be for the set to be drafted.
As they had to handle these design problems, right, each initial type had ally colors, like you were saying. So merfolk had blue and white, but once it got into Shadowmoor, it was blue-black, which are enemy colors. And so if every single type has ally color and an enemy color, because there's a Shadowmoor and a Lorwyn side, then there's going to be a lot of this cross-typal synergy that's going to have to come into play. And it's also possible that with 8 types and technically 16 of those types, because there's a dark and a light side, that there might just be too much filling the space. Instead, I think deciding to go against the initial themes of the set of Shadowmoor, and a good example of this is the Sig modal card, the double face card, is that they just outright decided that merfolk are no longer, even if it's a Shadowmoor side, is going to be white instead of going to be blue.
Which I think for Sig in particular is pretty strange. Because
I don't know anything about Sig.
Sig has a blue-white version and has a blue-black version, right? And like they're two, like one is Sig River Guide, where he's like a good guy, you know, in Lorwyn, and then he has Sig River Cutthroat in Shadowmoor, right? Like there's an extreme dichotomy between these two characters, and you can see that sort of like mirrored plane of existence in that way, right? In through these iconic characters, where now you've got Sig, who's, you know, he was blue on the front and then white on the back, but the white is his Shadowmoor version.
I think that's what's most confusing, is that like they clearly had these defined colors for Shadowmoor and for Lorwyn, and for them to still have the artwork be depicting of this, but not have the color philosophy and identity represent that character in its Shadowmoor side, I think doesn't fulfill what the double face cards were even supposed to be doing in the first place, right? Which is showing that duality. And
which
so
I do think the double face cards are a decent solution for showing that duality, right? They sort of like they're sort of one part of the same being, but there's 2 sides to them. There's the light side and the dark side, and it's an example, and it's in a singular card. But then, you know, it's sort of like in their design solutions for the draft part of the set for making the sort of color pairings work, they decided to kind of like merge these 2 things. And they're kind of saying that like, well, Vision created these neutral areas and like ways for us to do this. But I'm like, I think, for me, vision-wise for this type of fantasy, having those two things mixed like that, I think now becomes a bit confusing, right? It just feels muddy. It feels like it's called Lorwyn Eclipsed, but we have Lorwyn and Shadowmoor existing all the same thing.
Right. I mean, I think we mentioned it earlier, but like, if every single set ideally should have some sort of an identifiable like keyword, right? And if this one is duality, right? Or if you wanted to elongate it, light and dark, like having that light and dark or that duality be intermingled in a way to the point that you're not even totally able to clearly identify what is the light side and the dark side.
Yeah, SIG being a good example.
SIG is a good example that it makes it really difficult for people on the outside to be able to look in and go, well, what is this set actually about? Which is running into the same issues that the original Lorwyn was running into.
Well, and a lot of it, too, is sort of informed by the fact that we know these characters from original Lorwyn. And if you're coming in now and you didn't experience original Lorwyn and don't know anything about the first set.
I didn't know about SIG, so I just saw SIG and just went, oh, well, that's a good merfolk and a bad merfolk. But I didn't understand that, well, those colors are actually supposed to represent only the good merfolk.
Right. Yeah, which, like, look, it's not that you can't change these things, but I think the best example here is Kamigawa, right? Yeah. Where when they go to approach a return to Kamigawa, they reimagine it as Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And they sort of separated themselves from the original Kamigawa, who's, that sort of, those sets were not all that successful. But we go into Neon Dynasty, suddenly we have a complete reimagining. And it frees you from a lot of the sort of places you were hung up with the original set, and you don't necessarily have to like, you can sort of like pay homage in like more freely, right? You can reinterpret characters and things like, Beseju is still here because Beseju is the forever tree or whatever. It's always around. But you get to free yourself from the chains of the original set.
And it's not to say that you like can't still, like you said, pay homage. Like like Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, it still had ninjutsu and it still had channel. It still had a couple of what I'm assuming, considered the more iconic mechanics to come out of that. And overall, the flavor of the set still felt very Kamigawa. And it's not like Lorwyn had to be drastically different. You could see these potential issues with not only from like a marketing standpoint, but even seeing these set design or mechanics issues further back and go, okay, well, these are going to be problems that we have to solve. So is that something that we have to make up for in the narrative? Or if we're thinking about how we really want to depict this, what's the right amount of time lead up to make sure that we have the time to make sure that this is fulfilling, right? From a set design standpoint.
Well, how do you reapproach Lorwyn? Like, how do you come back to this plane and figure out some way to be able to reinterpret this? And honestly, look, I'm saying that like the dichotomy of these, the sort of light and dark side of this is the most important thing. It didn't have to be, I guess. Like, let's say you end up staying just in Lorwyn and you're not really worried about Shadowmoor. Maybe Shadowmoor's there and we can do a dark crystal thing where you're kind of like locking Shadowmoor away, but it's seeping out. But it's not like Shadowmoor, like Lorwyn and Shadowmoor in equal parts. Right. It's like mostly Lorwyn and a little bit of Shadowmoor. Right. And like, then with the Lorwyn side of this, you can lean into that sort of like Studio Ghibli-esque in today's like sort of current landscape. I think that is what would attract people most to this set. I like the dark side of the stuff maybe more than others might, but like I think that would free you a bit from trying to do all of these things at once.
Yeah. And it's tough to say based off of what they were saying in the article, if their decision to try and have Shadowmoor and Lorwyn intermingle was more of a narrative driven decision or of a design decision that they had to adjust the narrative around.
It sounded like they were running into these design problems and they sort of morphed things to just be the easiest to fit with the mold that they have.
And I think that's my biggest gripe with it, I suppose, is that if there are these design issues, right, but you intermingling things goes completely against that duality, right? If the duality of keeping these things separate, and again, it's like, it's not about conflict. It's like you said, it doesn't have to be like literal all-out war between Shadowmoor and Lorwyn or something like that, but there should still be some level of conflict. And so far, like if I'm looking at the cards that have been revealed, I'm not getting any sense of what this conflict is. These people are all just there hanging out. And like, maybe that's it. That's fine, I guess. I don't know. But like, it doesn't feel like there's a clear narrative or story when I'm looking at these cards.
And this is what makes me think if like you stick just in Lorwyn, you can kind of almost do a slice of life set. You don't need that conflict. You get to portray, exaggerated food and,
it's like Bloomburrow at that point.
It's kind of like Bloomburrow, but not, anthropomorphic animals. But then like, you bring up a good point though. Like we've got Bloomburrow, we've got Eldraine, we've got Lorwyn, we've got the Hobbit set coming up. How do you make sure that you're differentiating these enough that they feel distinct in people's minds, right? Because in some ways, I think Eldraine was kind of them trying to redo Lorwyn already. Now, Eldraine and Lorwyn are not like if we're talking subgenre. Technically, they are not the same thing. Eldraine is much more Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale inspired stuff, like Disney-esque, where Lorwyn is much more in the Jim Henson Shakespearean unseelie, unseelie court side of these things. They're not the same mythos, right? They are two different subgenres, but like that is a really subtle distinction to most people.
Right. And I mean, they pretty much would have had to push those distinctions much further, right? To make sure that you wouldn't confuse the two. And I think right now, I don't know if that's pushed enough. There's certain aspects of like seeing how the merfolk are depicted or the goblins depicted or whatever. But like, I think you have to really know Magic lore and the IP to know specifically like, oh, those are Lorwyn goblins, or even know what a Kithkin is or anything like that, right? So I kind of wish that they had stuck a little bit more in that duality, that they'd stuck with it and not had the intermingling and focused more on what that conflict would look like if, let's say, that it was that Shadowmoor was just like sort of locked away, but that Shadowmoor was trying to break out, right? And there is a bit of a conflict between Shadowmoor creeping in through the world still, through little cracks or crevices or whatever, and Lorwyn trying to make sure that it's not going to creep back in and take over their world. But it feels a little bit like they kind of threw their hands in the air and went, well, we don't know, so let's just pick these two colors and call it good.
Well, you had an interesting idea when we were talking earlier about it, where we were talking about how they've used dual face cards so often at this point that I feel like they've forgotten that there's other tools, right? Like that there's other types of split cards that they could do. And if we're talking through this idea of like, well, what if Shadowmoor were sort of creeping back in? We could show that like instead we could do the split. You were mentioning the original split cards, and have like half of it be sort of the Lorwyn side and half of it be the Shadowmoor side, and it's like this duality that's happening, like, and that Shadowmoor's creeping back in the world through the magic or whatever it is, right, through the spells, right, and that you can have sort of a corrupted version of a card where it could either be the original split cards or it could even be the ones that are split cards that are in your graveyard. They flash back as a different card. I forget what those ones are called, but I
don't know if I've seen these.
Yeah, they're the cards themselves. I'll put one on screen, but they have like the split half of the card is rotated the other way. So when it's in your graveyard, you can have it sticking out a little bit. Anyway, they could have explored maybe like a different way to do this duality, I think. Right?
Yeah, I don't really like that they keep falling back on this sort of same double face cards, because I think that there's a reason that you'd want to do one or the other. And what they decided to do with these double face cards is it seemed they decided that they wanted it to be up to you on whether you wanted to transform, which again goes, I think, so much against what this whole world is about. This world is split apart. It's constantly shifting and changing. And if Shadowmoor or Lorwyn or whatever, like maybe the part of the world is not moving, and if you just decide to walk into Shadowmoor, then suddenly you're just part of Shadowmoor, I guess. Yeah. I don't know if that's what they're expecting or if it's constantly ebbing and flowing and moving around.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, from Mark's article, they were saying that early on in design, you didn't nearly have nearly as much agency about this transformation stuff. Yeah. And then later on, they sort of added that agency back in, because I think gameplay wise, that fits better. Sure. But like, again, do you need the dual face cards to do this?
Right. Or can you do this in another way?
Right. And I think the split cards maybe just would have been a better, more iconic solution, right? I do think that because dual face is happening so often now, it's just sort of a given that it's there, and we're not doing any kind of special, it doesn't make things feel all that special, I guess.
Yeah. And I think the split cards also would potentially allow you to play with the enemy and ally colors more effectively than the double face cards, depending on how you end up accessing the double face cards.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. It's interesting because like I'm really glad to be going back to Lorwyn. This is a set that is like near and dear to my heart, and obviously a huge influence on me artistically. But I think my trepidation here in looking at this set now, it's that it does feel like it was difficult for them to figure out how to combine the behemoth that was Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, and the way that they sort of mushed them together. Like, we went from a 4-set block to a single set. I definitely understand this impulse to want to make sure that you're preserving that duality, right? That you have Lorwyn and Shadowmoor both together, because that is sort of at the heart of this type of fantasy. But I do wonder if there could have been a different decision to be made that would have kept us just in Lorwyn, or, maybe Shadowmoor is less involved, where instead, now that we sort of have both intermixed together all the time, they feel much less distinct. Right. So
I find it strange that it seemed like they had a heavier focus, at least it sounds like this, at the vision design level, on making sure that there was favorability with what mechanics they brought back, as opposed to maybe deciding to rework more of them. Sure. And decide a little bit more on what's going to be better for this theming, and for the setting itself. Because if we look at the mechanics, the majority of the mechanics that they have in the set are reworks of an existing thing. They didn't bring back Devotion instead of Chroma, but they have a different sort of a color matters, or color permanence, color pips matter sort of an ability. And Blight is kind of a reworked version of Wither.
Yeah, a little bit.
And everything else, Behold is like Champion. Like, everything is sort of bringing back these mechanics, but that wasn't, it seems, what most people loved about Lorwyn.
It's the world.
Now, that being said, you should still bring back some of it. -1/-1 counters sounds like that was a pretty big part of it. That's something that felt emblematic of Shadowmoor. Sure. And so I think keeping that there makes sense. But you could do it in so many different ways, right?
Yeah. It does feel like they've kind of taken what was there and updated it based on like the design experience they've had since Lorwyn, but it doesn't feel like there's a lot new here.
Right.
Yeah, and I do wonder how much of their, I don't know, obviously we weren't there, we didn't design the set, but I do wonder how much of that came down to either time constraints or I guess just like being beholden and to the original set, right? Like we want to make sure that we're, hitting these nostalgia notes for these past players. And I'm like, well, for me at least, the nostalgia that's there is from the setting itself. Yeah. And that, like, if you're bringing back the Kithkin and the tree folk and the scarecrows and the elves and the uniqueness that the elves are in this world, I think that's enough to go ahead and experiment with some new stuff.
I mean, if we compare it to Kamigawa, but also now Tarkir, now that we're kind of revisiting these planes after several years, but I think that they reevaluated and rightfully so, recognized that, like, why do people like this plane? They like dragons. Dragons is the thing. Having cons of Tarkir be the selling point doesn't make sense for people that don't know what a con is and they don't know where Tarkir is. So instead, just say Dragonstorm in cool letters and people will get the picture of what that set is all about. And you can change the sort of the structure of the set around that idea. And they did. They had dragons be much more at the forefront of that set because they knew that that's the selling point.
Yeah. Yeah, and this type of fantasy does feel harder to do that with, right? That the iconicness is just not there in the same way, and in so many ways, this is the strength of this particular subgenre. But what I will say is that somebody on the marketing team somewhere understood the assignment and hired Jim Henson to do the promo video, because that incredible. Like that's exactly what we're talking about, right? Like that. Understanding the sort of lineage of this type of fantasy, I think is really important.
Now, whether that will resonate with enough people, we'll see.
Right. And honestly, I don't know, right? Like this type of fantasy is underrepresented currently and has been for quite a while. I mean, its heyday was basically the 80s at this point with Labyrinth and Dark Crystal and Jim Henson Company generally.
Dark Crystal had their Netflix show.
They did have their Netflix show. Yeah. And that was, I guess, popular. I don't know, get 2 seasons? Did it get 2?
I think it got 2.
Yeah. It is interesting because I do think that this type of fantasy is like beloved to a niche audience. Like it's like really deep for that audience, but it's not that wide.
I think there's sleeper cells all over the world that they just need the right thing.
We'll find out.
And like, I just don't think anything's quite hit it yet.
Yeah. It's possible.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about Lorwyn a whole bunch, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
Also, if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.